he was interested, Putin, in conquering all of Ukraine, why in God's name would he be negotiating with Zelensky to end the war? And of course, what they were negotiating about was NATO expansion into Ukraine, which was the principal cause of the war. People in the West don't want to hear that argument because if it is true, which it is, then the West is principally responsible for this bloodbath that's now taking place. And of course, the West doesn't want to be principally responsible. It wants to blame Vladimir Putin.
This is a strong statement, isn't it? Even more so if we consider that it's made by someone as knowledgeable and thoughtful as the professor of Chicago University, John Mearsheimer. He did it on the Lex Fridman's podcast several months ago, among other things they discussed, but it caught my attention just now. Nevertheless, the topic is as valid today as it was then, perhaps even more so, as it feels the war is at its inflection point and may turn to a peace settlement soon. What kind of peace will it be? This, to a great extent, depends on the forces that were behind the war in the first place. If the professor is right, and it is the West policies to blame, then the peace negotiation will allow to address and fix these policies, thus bringing hope for a lasting solution. I am less optimistic because I see the causation differently. Mainly because being a native Russian, I have what the professor doesn't, first-hand reading of the internal situation in my country and its likely causal role in why the war happened. Let me try to explain it, but before that, let me say a few words about who I am. My name is Anton Basov, and a couple of months ago I have started this YouTube channel, The Power Instinct. The idea was mostly to make some quality content for the Russian-speaking audience on things like psychology of power and its various implications, from social phenomena such as totalitarian societies, cults, and the like, to the effects that power context makes on individual minds. I am not a political pundit, let alone military expert, and I didn't intend to talk about the war. So many people do it nowadays. But watching the podcast, I felt it's worth at least sharing some thoughts on what's led to the war. Since the original discussion was in English, I decided to try to do it in English either. I would appreciate your comments on whether you found this analysis valuable. This will help me see if I should continue to do something for the English-speaking audience. In any case, I am grateful for your attention. So, here we go. One thing we can be certain about when we hear statements from professors is that they have some theory behind them. The idea that Putin was in a way forced to invade Ukraine by the West, and specifically by US behavior and NATO's expansion to the Russian borders, is clearly not new. The interesting part is how it is substantiated. I didn't buy into whatever I heard so far, but I'm definitely curious to see the professor's logic. The starting point seems to be the so-called structural view on the international politics. It is structural in the sense that the structure of the politics realm, rather than individual countries' traits or properties, dictates what states will do to survive. Survival is perceived as the ultimate goal, because those who don't pursue it will not get through the tough international competition and disappear, thus becoming irrelevant for determining the rules of the game. In the words of the professor,
a realist like me would say that it doesn't matter whether a state is a democracy or not. All states behave the same way because the structure of the system, getting back to our earlier discussion about international anarchy, the structure of the system leaves those states no choice, whether they're democracies or autocracies.
Now, what is essential for survival? Because the domain of the world politics is not controlled by any single acknowledged authority, it is an anarchy. Anarchy as the opposite of hierarchy. In such environment, argues Professor Mearsheimer, Individual states will seek to become more powerful to deter potential aggressors. Okay, let's see how all this applies to the situation with the Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Firstly, the professor seems to claim that Russia didn't really mean to conquer Ukraine. Let's listen to his arguments.
If Vladimir Putin were bent on conquering all of Ukraine, he would have needed at least 2 million troops. I would argue he'd need 3 million troops, because not only do you need to conquer the country, you then have to occupy it. But the idea that 190,000 troops was sufficient for conquering all of Ukraine is not a serious argument. Furthermore, he was not interested in conquering Ukraine, and that's why in March 2022, this is immediately after the war starts, he is negotiating with Zelensky to end the war. There are serious negotiations taking place in Istanbul involving the Turks, and Naftali Bennett, who was the Israeli prime minister at the time, was deeply involved in negotiating with both Putin and Zelensky to end the war. Well, if he was interested, Putin, in conquering all of Ukraine, why in God's name would he be negotiating with Zelensky to end the war?
Okay, if Russia didn't mean to conquer Ukraine by sending 190,000 men there, then what on earth did it mean? There must be some reason for doing that, right? Professor doesn't offer an explanation, and it cannot come with anything convincing either. Was the plan to conquer this just the part of Ukraine, Donbass, but then why marching on Kiev, Chernihiv, Kharkov? Or maybe the idea was to force the Ukrainian government to negotiate the neutral status and these kind of things. But how Putin could achieve that, having insufficient military might, as the professor seems to assert? Would it not make more sense to suggest that deployment of such a limited military force was just Putin's mistake, his misjudgment of Ukrainians' true attitude, miscalculation of their will to resist? And the Istanbul negotiations shortly after was just a recognition of this mistake and an attempt to quickly fix it, simply because Putin didn't expect and was not prepared for a long war with substantial military support of Ukraine by the West. Okay, let's assume now that Putin did mean to invade Ukraine and take it under control by changing the government to the loyal one, but this is only because of the NATO. A sort of preventive measure in case Ukraine and the alliance may want to move with the membership at some point in the future, thus compromising Russia's security. Certain things even seem to point in that direction. For instance, an ultimatum from Russia just before the invasion, demanding basically to abandon the open-door policy for entering NATO by new members, obviously including Ukraine, and to refrain from deployment of military forces in the members which joined after 1997. But what is the purpose behind? To protect Russia against potential aggression? To answer this question, we can look at Russia's reaction to the recent decision of Finland to join NATO, which was very limited. Is it not surprising, considering that the land border between Russia and alliance with this change more than doubled? But it looks that Putin just doesn't really care about this much. Why? This doesn't make much sense if he sees NATO members as potential aggressors. But it makes just perfect sense if he sees NATO as a defensive alliance, because he obviously has no plans to invade Finland, so he doesn't care if the country gets this additional level of defense, unlike with Ukraine. Here, NATO's protection does matter and may change the whole story if he has plans for the country. To be honest, I believe Putin is quite happy with the NATO because it gives him such nice excuses, such a compelling explanation for his military plans and activities, both inside the country and abroad. And I'm certain he understands and appreciates its defensive character. Not in the sense that the alliance can be used only for defense, rather that the members are bound only by the defense commitment and are free not to join offensive initiatives. That means that in the unlikely event of some NATO member attacking Russia, other members will join only if they wish so. They are not obliged. But should there be such a wish, they can do it without NATO, making on-spot alliance specifically for this purpose, as for example the US and Great Britain did for the Iraq invasion in 2003, under the false allegation of development of the weapons of mass destruction there, as you remember. With some little help from Australia and Poland, they managed to complete the active part of operation without NATO. So, as an offensive tool, NATO is of limited value and definitely not necessary. Does Putin understand it? I think so. Why then ultimatum before the invasion of Ukraine? I believe purely for political reasons, to once again emphasize the NATO as the casus belli and pretend that Russia was willing to avoid the conflict if only her concerns were heard and respected. Now, if we rule out NATO as the reason for invading Ukraine, what's there left? Why Putin did it, taking all these seemingly unnecessary risks? Some people think that Putin is obsessed with Ukraine, fearing that the developments there, in a way, foreshadow what may eventually happen in Russia, where some destructive forces inspired by the West will benefit from the Ukrainian experience and grab the power from Putin's hands. To me, it sounds far-fetched and too complicated. I believe there is a simple explanation, also related to the power, but in a more direct and plausible way. To understand it, however, we need to get back to the very beginning of the Putin's rule. Putin is known in the world as a KGB man. Some would even claim that he was on a kind of mission to bring to power the FSB, a present-day reincarnation of KGB. This speculation is partly based on what he said in December of 1999, speaking in front of the FSB people.
Группа сотрудников ФСБ, направленные вами для командировку для работы под прикрытием правительства, на первом этапе со своими задачами справляется.
Somewhat playfully, he said that a group of officers on the undercover assignment in the government has proved efficient on the first stage, hinting that the FSB had launched a secret mission to infiltrate the government. The way it was said allows an easy interpretation as just a joke, but it allows also more conspiratorial interpretations. Yet it is very difficult for me to believe that Putin at that point could represent FSB and even fully rely on its support. There are certain facts that we need to keep in mind. Firstly, practically all his years in KGB, Putin had a fairly modest rank of lieutenant colonel, being a resident in Dresden, East Germany, definitely not a dream position for an intelligence officer in those times. He hardly had access to the influential top level of the organization. Yes, for 1 year he was assigned by Yeltsin, the director of FSB, before naming him a successor. But this very fact that he was put in the role by the liberal president Yeltsin must have made him look an outsider for the traditional KGB elite, at least at that point. This is the second reason. And thirdly, the main competitor for Putin for the upcoming presidential election of 2000 was Primakov, an old-school guy, a hardliner who cancelled his trip to the US, turning around his plane above the Atlantic Ocean once he's learned about the decision to bomb Yugoslavia by NATO. Primakov was also for several years a director of the First Directorate, the foreign intelligence of KGB-FSB. Who should we expect to be more influential in the FSB? Some former lieutenant colonel who even resigned from the service to join Sobchak, a liberal mayor of St. Petersburg, then promoted by Yeltsin, perceived by many as bearing part of responsibility for the collapse of the Soviet Union and further devastating situation in the country, or a reputable and conservative top-rank leader who clearly demonstrated that he was not going to swallow all these insults from the West, my bets would be clearly on the Primakov side. By the way, this is exactly the reason why I don't particularly believe that FSB was behind all those terrorist attacks. I mean, when several buildings were exploded in Moscow and elsewhere in the fall of 1999, which boosted Putin's ratings. I don't think the level of control of FSB would allow Putin's allies in the organization to realize such an operation, let alone to prevent the information leakage from it. So the paradox of the initial phase of Putin's rule was that he, a former KGB guy, was put in power by the Yeltsin's family and oligarchs, such as Boris Berezovsky, who were not particularly likable people for the FSB elite, consistent to the great extent of those brought up in the Soviet times in line with the ethics, political views and traditions of the KGB. Naturally, Putin had to be liberal in the beginning, continuing the political line of Yeltsin and his elite, including friendly relationship with Western countries. Even if he had a kind of mandate from FSB, it would hardly change anything because FSB, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, had very limited real power. Who did have the power, however, was mass media, the power that Putin could appreciate from his personal experience, when he, literally unknown to the Russian people just a year ago, thanks to intense media support, became the most popular public leader. But once in power, he quickly realized the flip side of the media attention, with bitter critics of the war in Chechnya, the Kursk submarine tragedy, and so on. No wonder that Putin, with his innate drive for control, decided to eliminate this prominent threat to his power early on. How could he accomplish that? Well, in the most natural way for someone with the KGB background, by using the state power, or to be more precise, by the law enforcement agencies. On the 7th of May 2000, Putin officially took office as the president of Russia. And already on the 11th of May, the FSB, the Central Prosecutor's Office, and the Tax Police searched offices of the Mediamost holding, which owned the NTV television channel, the one most in opposition to Putin, and the one which criticized him most severely. The Mediamost holding belonged to one of the oligarchs, Kuczynski, who was the first of them to go to prison, albeit for a short time. He then immigrated to Spain and eventually lost his media assets. Then came the turn of Berezovsky, the oligarch close to the Yeltsin's family, actively involved in efforts to bring Putin to power. Berezovsky left for London and lost control of the RT television channel, the other important one. Securing his control over the media, Putin could eventually move to extending his power over industrial assets. The next important step in his first term was the attack on the oil giant Yukos and its owners, first of all Khodorkovsky. After that, the remaining oligarchs never dared to challenge Putin, and he could relatively freely set out to put important assets under the control of his friends and allies, many of whom he knew from his years in KGB. The so-called siloviki, law enforcers, in general were given many opportunities to benefit one way or another from the new economic model created by Putin, with extended state control over the industries and large budget financing of various projects. Access to the controlled financial flows became an important tool to ensure loyalty of the Putin's elite. One important thing to understand about Putin's Russia is its ideological weakness, which makes it quite different from the Soviet Union. Unlike the latter, Russia does not have a strong ideology, and subsequently has difficulties to mobilize people on the basis of some super idea like the promise of communism in the Soviet time, for example. As a result, Putin has to rely on the more universal material forms of motivation to consolidate the elite. And he was lucky with the timely increase in oil prices to have money for that. Although he also did a lot to take over the most important businesses and financial flows. So when we hear about high level of corruption in Russia, it's not so much the story of weak social institutions or some legislative gaps. Rather, it's the story of the power control and consolidation. The problem with the Putin's elite, however, was that, in essence, it's based on the siloviki, the military and law enforcement corps, and a significant part of it are old-timers, people who perceive the world through the Soviet-era paradigm of the struggle against the West. Despite benefiting from the free market economy and appearance of the new generation of career-oriented officials, overall mood has always been quite confrontational. Many has viewed collapse of the Soviet Union as the result of actions of the West and betrayal of some people at the top of USSR like Gorbachev. These people naturally interpret every step of the US and European countries as potentially hostile, aiming to prevent Russia's recovery from the collapse of the 90s. Now the problem of Putin was that he was increasingly leaning on the siloviki in his attempts to secure his power, which was in contradiction to the liberal course he inherited from Yeltsin, both in domestic affairs and especially in the foreign policy. This problem became critical by the end of his second term. By the constitution, he couldn't stay longer, and the situation was not yet ripe to change the constitution. There was some catch, however, that would, formalistically speaking, allow him to get back after being out for one term. The constitution said he couldn't stay more than 2 terms in a row, but not in total. So he needed someone to keep the place for him, and this someone must be weak enough to not to attempt to stay longer. But there was a challenge. A weak temporary successor could be easily manipulated by others as well. So to make sure that while he was out of the office, the successor is kept in check, Putin needed support from the broad elite, not just from the top slice of it. In other words, he needed to get himself associated to the maximum extent with the dominating sentiment of the siloviki and give them the sense of the new direction under his future leadership. Hence, the second half of his second term was quite telling. He became increasingly aggressive in rhetorics, which culminated in his famous Munich speech in February 2007. While more and more often blaming the West for whatever wrongdoings he saw, he set out also to actually punish smaller countries he could reach for their disloyalty, which then had the biggest impact on Georgia and Moldova, whose essential export to Russia was curtailed. Some experts would claim, of course, that Putin was just fed up with the West, especially the US, persistently ignoring essential Russia's interests. And this accumulated irritation just erupted at that point. While indeed the West wasn't particularly prudent, in my view, in how they managed relationship with Russia, and not only Russia, I doubt Putin and the way he ruled the country could evolve in any other direction anyway. He was dependent on the siloviki to stay in power, and therefore he was destined to speak with their voice. And when a society is driven by the military rather than by, say, business, it's just a question of time when it will get militarized to the extent of crossing the line between peace and war. Ironically, Ukraine has become the obsession of Putin because it was so close, not just geographically, but culturally and ethnically, to be perceived a part of the whole. Millions of mixed families, the Russian language known by almost all of the Ukrainian population and spoken by the big chunk of it as their language of choice, participation of ethnical Ukrainians in the Soviet leadership, and many other things. All this made the idea of losing Ukraine to the West look a complete fiasco for the Russian elite and therefore something unacceptable for Putin. Interestingly, even now, in the 30 year war, you can see ethnic Ukrainians or people born in Ukraine in Russia's top leadership supporting the invasion, and even among Russian military leadership. So it's clearly not the war between different ethnic groups, although the Ukrainian society seems to try hard to differentiate itself now. To me, the war looks like a logical, if not inevitable, result of the symbiosis of the military and law enforcement corps with FSB in the center of it, which was very strong in the USSR, weakened but not dismantled after its collapse, and the leader with broad formal power who, however, needed the actual power mechanism to keep his position. Given his background, this leader naturally turned to the siloviki and re-established them as the key mechanism to control society. But with that, he revived the old spirit of struggle and drive for expansion that existed in the Soviet time. Now, what's next? It is already clear that there won't be a glorious victory for Russia, whatever is the ending point of the war. To survive the disappointment of his elite, Putin will likely have to toughen the regime. He will likely punish top-level people associated with the war, firstly to shift responsibility to them, and secondly to send a message to the elite that he's ready to implement harsh measures and will not tolerate disloyalty. Then he will probably need to exploit this idea of crusade against the West to give the outlet to the militaristic rage in the absence of the real targets. That means a lot of disturbances in different places of the world, from indirect military involvement in Africa and Middle East to undermining politically the Western countries. But that's my reading of the situation, projecting the past and the intent. Obviously, new things will also come into play. Cyber Cold War will likely be one of them. Or maybe I'm excessively pessimistic and you see a brighter future. In which case, please share in the comments. We all need more bright colors and optimism. And this is basically all I had to say for now, inspired by Professor Mearsheimer, although probably not in the way he would expect. Nevertheless, I am grateful to him and to Lex Fridman for the opportunity to see a different perspective. I hope my perspective has offered some food for thought for some of you. I will be grateful for your feedback. Your likes and subscriptions are also welcome. This was Anton Basov on the channel The Power Instinct. All the best. Take care.